The rain had been falling since afternoon, steady and merciless, soaking the streets until the gutters overflowed. By the time night settled in, the house felt like it was floating inside a storm. I sat on the edge of the guest bed, listening to the water drumming against the roof, the wind scraping branches across the siding. For a long time, I thought maybe the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm I had walked into. Coming back home after years away had felt like a test I wasn't sure I wanted to take. I had told myself I was ready, stronger. I had worn my uniform like armor, but as soon as I unpacked my bag in this house, that armor slipped away. Here I was not Lieutenant Mason, not the officer who had managed supply chains during deployments, who had endured long nights at sea. Here I was only Catherine, the daughter who never measured up, the sister who learned early on to live in someone else's shadow. That shadow had a name, my brother. From the moment I arrived, I felt it again. The air shifting whenever he entered a room, the way our parents' faces lit up for him, the way I had to adjust myself, shrink myself, just to keep the peace. He had been restless during my visit, carrying himself with a tension that rubbed against my skin like sandpaper. He barely looked at me when I greeted him, his hug nothing more than a stiff brush of arms. I tried to remind myself of the girl I used to be here, the girl who learned that silence was survival. When he shouted, I stayed quiet. When he broke things, I cleaned them up. When our parents excused his behavior, I swallowed my doubts. Years later, standing in that house again, I felt the old habits return as easily as breathing. But I had forgotten one truth: storms never die quietly. That night it started with a sound. Heavy footsteps upstairs, the creak of the floorboards beneath his weight. I could picture him pacing, fists clenching and unclenching, the kind of pacing that always meant trouble. I walked into the hallway, telling myself it was nothing. But when I saw him come down the stairs, I knew. His jaw was tight, his shoulders rigid, his eyes sharp and unfocused. He carried the kind of anger that needed a target, and I was standing right there. He accused me before I could even speak, said I had told our mother he was lazy, that I was always trying to humiliate him. His voice was sharp enough to cut. I blinked, stunned. I hadn't said a word about him, but the truth had never mattered to him. What mattered was the story he needed to tell himself, and in that story I was always the villain. I tried to calm him, my voice low, steady, like talking to a wild animal. I told him he was mistaken, that I hadn't said anything. I thought maybe reason could work, but reason had never had a place in this house. He came closer, the heat of his anger radiating off him. I could smell sweat and something sour on his breath. His words blurred into a roar: lazy, useless, better than us. His favorite accusations. My pulse hammered in my ears. Then it happened. His hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. The grip was merciless, squeezing until the bone itself felt like it might snap. I gasped and tried to twist free, but he yanked me forward and shoved me into the dresser behind me. The sound I heard was one I will never forget. A deep, splitting crack. For a moment I thought it was the wood, but then pain exploded through my arm, sharp and searing, flooding my body with fire. I tried to cry out, but the sound came out strangled, choked. He didn't stop. His other hand slammed into my shoulder, shoving me harder, and there was another crack, sickening and final. My other arm folded in a way it was never meant to. The shock stole my breath. The room tilted, colors bleeding together as I tried to stay upright. I screamed then, full-throated, but his palm crashed over my mouth, muffling me. His face hovered inches from mine, his eyes wild, unrecognizable. His breath hit my skin as he hissed that I was always making things about me, always ruining everything. Tears blurred my vision, mixing with the sweat dripping down his forehead. The storm outside crashed against the walls, thunder booming like cannon fire, but I only heard the words pouring from him, each one sharper than the last. I thrashed against him, the agony in my arms screaming louder than my voice. My legs gave out and I collapsed onto the floor, my body folding awkwardly, pain spreading like lightning. My head spun, my chest heaved. I could barely breathe. Time broke apart. One moment I was on the floor, the next I was drifting, hovering at the edge of consciousness. The storm became distant, a hum in my skull. I tried to move, but every shift sent waves of agony up my arms. They lay at impossible angles, swollen and heavy, foreign to me. Then I saw her. My mother stood in the doorway. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, her eyes wide, her lips parted as if the words had been stolen from her tongue. For a heartbeat, I thought she would run to me. I thought she would cry out, call for help, cradle me the way she used to when I scraped my knees as a child. But she didn't move. Her eyes left me and drifted past my broken body to him, standing just behind her, chest heaving, sweat dripping, fear flickering behind his rage. My throat burned as I forced the words out. He broke my arms. She flinched but didn't look at me. Her gaze stayed locked on him. Tears filled her eyes, but her voice came soft, brittle, almost pleading. Just say you fell, please. The words struck harder than his fists. Just say you fell. The betrayal was absolute. My mother, the nurse who had spent decades tending to the broken and the bleeding, looked at my mangled arms and chose silence. She chose him. She chose the lie. I felt my chest cave in with something deeper than pain. The storm outside wailed, lightning flashing across the windows, but all I could hear was the echo of her voice, begging me to protect him instead of me. In that moment, something inside me shifted. Something that had been coiled tight for years finally snapped. My arms were broken, my body wrecked, but my voice, my truth, was the only thing I had left. And if I didn't use it, I knew I would disappear into their silence forever. The storm rattled the house, wind howling through the eaves, and I understood with a clarity sharper than the pain in my bones. If I stayed quiet, I would never survive this place. If I stayed quiet, no one would ever hear me. And for the first time in my life, silence was no longer an option. I lay on the floor, my breath shallow, my arms screaming with every heartbeat. The pain came in waves, crashing over me until my body was nothing but raw nerve and fire. I tried to focus on anything else: the rain, the thunder, the steady drip of water leaking from the roof into a pan in the corner. But no sound could drown out the silence that followed my mother's words. Just say you fell. I repeated them in my head, as if maybe I had misheard. But no, I knew her voice too well. She was pleading with me not for my sake, but for his. Protect him. Sacrifice yourself again. That had always been the unspoken contract in this house. The memory of my childhood came rushing back like water breaking through a dam. Nights when he broke my toys and they told me to share. Days when he shouted at me and they told me to be patient, he didn't mean it. Times when his fists found me in the hallway and they told me to toughen up, that boys were just rough. I had learned to bury those moments to carry them quietly, because speaking had never changed anything. Speaking had only earned me blame. But that night, as I looked up from the floor, arms twisted and useless, something inside me hardened. I whispered, my throat raw, my voice shaking. He broke my arms. My mother flinched again, her lips trembling. My brother's eyes darted between us, panic creeping into the edges of his rage. He muttered something I couldn't catch, his voice low and desperate. He wasn't apologizing. He was afraid of the consequences, afraid that this time he had gone too far. My father appeared then, drawn by the noise. He stopped at the base of the stairs, his face set in that grim mask he always wore when he didn't want to get involved. His eyes fell on me, then on my brother, then on my mother. And just like that, I knew what side he would take. He didn't rush to me. He didn't call for help. He simply asked what happened, his voice flat, almost bored. I tried to answer, but my mother's voice cut through mine, trembling and fast. She fell, she said. She slipped. The words felt like knives. My father gave me a long, unreadable look, then nodded. No argument, no outrage, no disbelief, just acceptance. He had made his choice, too. Something inside me cracked wider than my bones. I closed my eyes against the blur of tears. Every inhale felt jagged, like glass in my lungs. My arms throbbed, swollen and broken, but the pain that consumed me now wasn't only physical. It was the certainty that I was utterly alone in this house. The storm outside thundered, rattling the windows as if the sky itself was screaming for me, but inside these walls my voice was nothing. Time blurred after that. My mother helped me to my feet, her hands gentle but not affectionate. My brother hovered in the corner, muttering excuses, pacing like a caged animal. My father disappeared into the kitchen, as if making coffee could erase the image of his daughter crumpled on the floor. They guided me to the couch, pressing ice to my swollen arms. My mother's eyes never met mine. She kept whispering that it would be all right, that I needed to calm down, that accidents happen. Each word dug deeper, erasing me, rewriting my truth before I could even hold on to it. I wanted to scream, to shatter the silence, to make them see me. But my voice cracked under the weight of their denial. Somewhere deep inside, though, a flame flickered. A tiny spark, fragile but alive. The realization that I could not survive here if I let them take my truth away. I stared at my arms, bent and bruised, and I thought about the Navy. About the woman I became when I put on that uniform. The woman who could endure endless hours at sea, who carried responsibility not just for herself, but for her crew. That woman had never been silent. That woman had never looked away from the truth. Why should I look away now? The night stretched long. Hours bled together in a haze of pain and exhaustion. My brother disappeared into his room, the door slamming shut like a gunshot. My father watched television, the volume turned up too loud, drowning out everything. My mother sat beside me, her hand resting on mine, as if the weight of her touch could erase the betrayal in her voice. When the clock ticked past midnight, I knew I couldn't stay. I told her I needed a hospital. She hesitated, then nodded, but not before warning me again. Please, Catherine, please don't say it was him. Please don't ruin his life. Her plea, her fear. All of it wrapped around me like chains. But somewhere in that darkness, I felt the first tug of defiance. I didn't answer her, not with words. I just closed my eyes and let the storm outside carry me. Later, when the paramedics arrived, she told them I had fallen down the stairs. Her voice was steady, convincing, like she had rehearsed the line for years. I sat there, silent, my arms cradled in agony, watching the lie take shape around me. And for the first time, I realized I didn't have to accept it. The storm outside began to ease, the rain softening to a drizzle. But inside me, a new storm was gathering. One that no amount of silence could contain. I didn't know then how far it would take me, how much I would lose, how much I would rebuild. All I knew was that something had changed. The silence I had carried my whole life had finally shattered, and I would never put it back together again. The ride to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights and muffled voices. The paramedics spoke in clipped tones, efficient and detached, their hands moving quickly as they stabilized my arms. I could hear my mother beside me, her voice steady as she repeated the story. She fell. She slipped on the stairs. It was dark, the floor was wet. An accident. I lay on the stretcher, my body writhing with pain, listening to her words loop over and over like a broken record. She didn't falter once. She knew the script by heart. I kept my eyes closed, not because I agreed, but because I couldn't bear to look at her. The ambulance rattled along the wet roads, each bump sending a fresh bolt of agony through me. I bit down hard on my lip, tasting iron. Every part of me wanted to scream the truth, but I stayed quiet, clinging to the silence like a lifeline. Not because I wanted to protect him, but because I needed time. Time to breathe, time to think. When the doors burst open and they wheeled me inside, the hospital air hit me sharp, antiseptic, humming with fluorescent light. Nurses swarmed, voices cutting through the haze, questions fired one after another. How did it happen? Where does it hurt? Can you move your fingers? My mother answered before I could. She slipped. She fell. The lie wrapped around me like a blanket, suffocating, heavy, impossible to shake. I wanted to scream, to rip it off me, but I didn't. Not yet. My silence wasn't submission. It was a gathering storm. They wheeled me into radiology, slid me onto the cold table. The X-ray machine hummed, capturing the truth in black and white even as everyone around me spun lies. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the cracks in the plaster, letting the machine tell the story my voice couldn't. When the doctor came in, he looked at the scans, his brows pulling together in a frown. Both arms, he said slowly. Multiple fractures. Severe trauma. His eyes lifted to mine, sharp and questioning. You're sure this was a fall? My throat tightened. My mother shifted in the corner, clutching her purse, her face arranged in practiced worry. I could feel her stare drilling into me, begging me to play along. My lips trembled, and for a moment I almost did. Years of habit pressed down on me, urging me to stay quiet. But then I remembered the sound, the crack of bone against bone, the hiss in my ear, stop making everything about yourself. The truth slammed back into me, undeniable, unshakable. I met the doctor's eyes. No, I whispered, it wasn't a fall. The room went still. My mother stiffened, her breath caught. The doctor leaned forward, his face careful, calm. Tell me what happened, he said. My chest rose and fell, my voice barely above a whisper. My brother did this. He broke my arms. The words left me trembling, but once spoken, they carried their own strength. I felt the weight lift off me, the silence cracking apart. My mother gasped, shaking her head, trying to cut me off, but the doctor raised his hand. That's enough, ma'am. For the first time, someone listened. The doctor called for security. A nurse placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, telling me I was safe now. Safe. The word sounded foreign, like a language I had never heard spoken in this house of healing. My mother's voice rose, frantic. She doesn't know what she's saying. She's confused, she's in pain. But I ignored her. My eyes stayed locked on the doctor, on the one person who had given me permission to speak. When the nurse wheeled me to a private room, my mother followed, her words sharp and desperate. Please, Catherine, you don't understand. If you report him, his life is over. He's family. You can't do this to us, not me. Never me. I closed my eyes, exhausted. The pain in my arms was relentless, but the ache in my chest was worse. I had broken the rule, the one I had followed my entire life. I had told the truth, and now there was no going back. Hours passed in a fog of painkillers and restless sleep. When I woke, the room was dim, a monitor beeping steadily at my side. My arms were wrapped in casts, heavy and immovable. I turned my head slowly and saw someone sitting in the chair by my bed. It wasn't my mother. It was a woman in uniform, her posture straight, her gaze steady. A Navy officer, older than me, with eyes that had seen far more than they revealed. She introduced herself quietly, her voice calm and precise. Commander Reeves, Medical Division. She had been called because I was an active-duty officer, and this was now more than a family matter. She studied me for a long moment before speaking again. "Falls don't break bones like this," she said. Her tone wasn't accusatory, just factual, the kind of truth that left no room for argument. I felt my throat tighten. I had already spoken the words once, but saying them again felt like climbing a mountain barefoot. Still, I did it. My brother, he did this. She nodded once, not surprised, not shocked. Then she leaned forward, her eyes sharp and unwavering. "You need to file a report." The words struck deep. A report meant permanence. It meant no turning back, no family dinners, no pretending it had never happened. It meant choosing myself over the people who had raised me. For a long moment, I just stared at her, my heart pounding, fear and doubt colliding inside me. But beneath it all was something stronger. The memory of my mother's plea, my father's silence, my brother's hands. I whispered, my voice hoarse but firm, "I will." Reeves sat back, her expression softening just slightly. "Good." In that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not safety, not peace, but power. Fragile, trembling, but mine. For the first time, the silence was broken. The hours after I said yes blurred into a strange mixture of stillness and storm. Paperwork appeared. Forms were brought in, questions were asked again and again, each one heavier than the last. Who did this? When did it happen? Was this the first time? I answered slowly, my voice low but steady. "My brother. Tonight." And no, it wasn't the first time. My words painted a picture I had never dared to share, not even with myself. Each answer was like pulling glass from a wound, but every shard I removed left me lighter. Commander Reeves sat through all of it. She didn't interrupt, didn't let her eyes wander, didn't write anything down until I finished speaking. There was something unshakable about her presence. She carried the kind of authority that didn't need to raise its voice. When she finally spoke, it was only to say, "You're doing the right thing, the right thing." I tried to hold onto that thought as the nurses adjusted my IV, as the painkillers surged through me, as exhaustion dragged me under again. The right thing. When I woke next, the room was empty except for the dim glow of a lamp on the side table. My casts felt heavier, as though my body had accepted that my arms were no longer mine. I stared at them for a long time, tracing the curves of plaster, the ridges where the nurses had written tiny notes in black marker. Left radius fracture, right humerus fracture. Technical words for what I already knew, broken. The door creaked open and I tensed. My mother slipped inside, her face shadowed by the low light. For a moment, I thought she might apologize, that she might finally say the words I had needed all my life. But she didn't. Her voice was hushed, urgent. "Catherine, you have to think about what this will do to us. Do you know what happens if this goes to court? Your brother could go to prison. Your father could lose his job. Everyone will talk." I stared at her, too tired to hide the disbelief on my face. I was lying in a hospital bed, both arms shattered, my body screaming, and she was worried about gossip. She leaned closer, her eyes glassy with desperation. "Please withdraw the report. We can fix this as a family." The words struck me harder than I expected. Even then, a part of me longed for her to choose me, to finally stand beside me, but she never would. Her loyalty wasn't mine to have, it belonged to the silence. To him, to the story they had been telling for years. I turned my face away, pressing my cheek into the pillow. "No," I whispered. "I can't." Her breath caught, a small gasp as though I had struck her. For a long moment, she stood there, trembling. Then she straightened, her voice sharp and cold in a way I had never heard before. "You're tearing this family apart." Tears stung my eyes, but I kept my voice firm. "No, he did." She left without another word. The door clicked shut and I lay there in the silence, my heart pounding. For years, I had been the one who kept us together, the one who stayed quiet, the one who absorbed the blows. Now, for the first time, I had refused. And it cost me her love, or maybe only the illusion of it. The next morning, Commander Reeves returned. She stood at the foot of my bed, her hands clasped behind her back. "There will be an investigation," she said. "You will have to testify. Are you ready for that?" Was I ready? No, but I had learned something in the last 24 hours. Readiness wasn't the point. The point was survival. The point was truth. I met her eyes, my voice steady. "Yes." She nodded, then pulled up a chair. She told me what would happen next, the paperwork, the hearings, the interviews. She didn't sugarcoat the difficulty, but she also didn't let me doubt myself. Every time my eyes flickered with uncertainty, she reminded me, "This is not your fault." The words unraveled something inside me, "Not your fault." I had heard the opposite all my life, that I provoked him, that I should be patient, that I was too sensitive. Hearing those 3 words, spoken without hesitation, was like a door opening. Later that day, 2 military police officers came to take my statement. They were calm, respectful, but their questions were precise, leaving no room to hide. I told them everything. The grip on my wrist, the shove into the dresser, the sickening cracks. My voice trembled, but I didn't stop. When I finished, one of them set down his pen and looked at me with quiet conviction. "We'll take it from here." After they left, I let myself breathe. Not fully, not freely, but more than I had in years. The hospital became my world for the next week. White walls, beeping machines, the constant hum of air vents. I hated every minute of it, but I also knew I needed it. Every time the nurses changed my bandages or checked my vitals, I felt the reminder of what had happened. Every ache was a memory, every twinge a truth I could no longer bury. One evening, as I stared out the window at the rain-soaked parking lot, Reeves returned. She didn't sit this time. She just stood beside me, her reflection merging with mine in the glass. She said quietly, "You've chosen a hard road, Catherine, but it's the only one that leads anywhere worth going." I didn't answer right away. I just kept staring at the reflection of the woman in uniform standing beside the broken woman in the hospital gown. One strong, one shattered. One I wanted to be again, one I couldn't escape. Finally, I whispered, "I don't want to be silent anymore." She nodded once, her reflection steady. "Then don't." In that moment, I felt something anchor in me. Not hope, not forgiveness, but resolve. My life had been split open, my body broken, my family gone, but I still had my voice, and I was done letting it be buried. Hospitals have their own kind of time. Days and nights blur together under fluorescent lights, measured not by sunrises, but by the beep of monitors and the rhythm of nurses' footsteps. I used to think deployments on ships dragged on forever, but nothing stretched longer than those white days after my arms were set in casts. Pain became my clock. Every morning it woke me before the nurses did. It wasn't sharp anymore, but constant, a throbbing ache that reminded me of what had been taken from me. Simple things, scratching my face, brushing my hair, holding a cup of water, were impossible now. I had to ask for help. I hated it. The nurses were kind. Too kind. Their smiles lingered as if they were afraid I might crumble if they let go. I resented that kindness, even as I depended on it. They held straws to my lips, tucked blankets around my shoulders, washed my hair in a basin when the weight of unwashed days became too much. I should have felt grateful. Instead, I felt humiliated. It was in those moments of helplessness that I realized how deep the wound really went. My brother hadn't just broken my arms. He had cracked open the illusion I had carried for years, that I could still belong to my family if I tried hard enough. Lying there in that hospital bed, I finally understood the truth. Belonging had never been mine. My mother came only once more. She slipped into the room late at night, her face pale under the dim light. She didn't sit. She didn't touch me. She just stood by the door and whispered that I could still change my mind, that it wasn't too late to protect him, that we could still fix this. Her words were shards of glass. I turned away, refusing to answer. When I looked back, she was gone. That was the last time I saw her in that hospital. My father never came, and in that silence I knew I had lost them. Or maybe they had lost me long ago and I was only now brave enough to admit it. Commander Reeves became my constant. She stopped by every day, her presence steady, grounding. She didn't coddle me. She didn't pity me. Instead, she spoke to me like I was still the officer she had read about in my file. She asked about my deployments, my duties, the missions I had overseen. She reminded me of the woman I was outside these walls. One afternoon, as I struggled with a cup of soup, she leaned against the wall and said quietly, "You can't go back there, Catherine." Her words startled me. "Go back where?" "Home," she said. "You can't return to that house. Not after this." I wanted to argue. Some stubborn part of me clung to the idea that maybe things could change, that maybe once the dust settled, we could start again. But deep down, I knew she was right. That house wasn't home. It was a cage, and every time I stepped back inside, I let the bars close around me. The thought of cutting ties terrified me. Family was supposed to be forever. No matter how flawed, no matter how broken, they were supposed to be the people who stayed. But mine hadn't stayed. They had abandoned me in the moment I needed them most. Still, admitting that truth felt like tearing out my own heart. Reeves must have seen the war inside me because she didn't push further. She only said, "Sometimes survival means walking away." And then she left me to think. The investigation moved forward faster than I expected. Military police came back with more questions, each one digging deeper. I told them about the shove, the grip, the words he spat into my ear. They asked if there had been other incidents, and I found myself dredging up memories I had buried years ago. The shove down the stairs when I was 16. The bruises I hid under long sleeves. The times he cornered me in the hallway, daring me to tell. I felt sick as I spoke, but also lighter. Every secret I released loosened the weight on my chest. At night, alone in my room, I replayed everything. My mother's plea, my father's silence, my brother's face twisted with rage, the sound of my own bones snapping. And then Reeves' voice, steady and unwavering, "You need to file a report." I had done it. I had broken the silence. But the cost was written all over me. One evening, as the sun sank outside the hospital windows, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink, I realized something. I was free from them. Not healed, not whole, but free. They could no longer control me with their silence. And yet freedom felt like grief. I grieved the parents I had wanted, the family I had tried so hard to protect. I grieved the years I had wasted trying to be enough for them. I grieved the illusion of belonging I had carried like a shield. The nurses called me brave, Reeves called me strong, but inside I felt hollow. The white days stretched on. Physical therapists came, urging me to move fingers to flex what little I could. The pain was unbearable, but I forced myself through it. Each small movement felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Each wince was proof that I was still alive, still fighting. One night, as I lay awake listening to the hum of machines, I whispered to myself, "I am not silent anymore." The words were shaky, fragile. But they were mine, and saying them out loud felt like planting a seed in scorched earth. It would take time to grow. But for the first time, I believed it could. Discharge came slowly, wrapped in paperwork and warnings. The doctors told me recovery would take months. They explained the surgeries, the physical therapy, the risks of limited motion. Their words blurred together until all I heard was the echo, "Long road." When the nurse wheeled me outside for the first time in weeks, the air struck me like a shock. Fresh, sharp, almost overwhelming. The world had kept turning while I was stuck inside those white walls. Cars rushed past on wet pavement, children laughed as they splashed in puddles, the smell of fried food drifted from a nearby cart. Everything was so normal it made me dizzy. Reeves was waiting by the curb. She drove me not to my parents' house, but to a small apartment maintained for service members in crisis. Temporary housing, safe, discreet. I stared at the building, its beige walls unremarkable, its windows square and plain. To anyone else it was nothing. To me it was freedom. She carried my bag inside herself, set it gently on the floor, then stood in the doorway as I took in the space. One room, a narrow kitchen, a bed made with military precision. It was small, almost stark. But it was mine. No footsteps pounding the stairs, no voices demanding silence, no threats hiding in shadows. Just four walls and a lock on the door. For the first time since childhood, I felt safe. Still, safety came with loneliness. Nights stretched long in that apartment. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, the casts on my arms heavy as stone. I wanted to call someone, to hear a familiar voice, but my phone stayed silent. My parents hadn't called once since I filed the report. My brother was under investigation, and from what little I heard through official channels, they had closed ranks around him. I had been cut out completely. The silence stung. I told myself I didn't need them, that I was better off without their lies. But the truth was harder. I wanted them to choose me. I wanted them to love me more than they loved the illusion of family unity. And every day they didn't call was proof that they never would. Therapy became my lifeline. Physical therapy for my arms, grueling sessions where each tiny movement felt like torture. And counseling, where I sat across from a quiet woman with kind eyes who asked questions no one had ever dared ask me. What did you feel when your mother told you to lie? Why do you think you stayed silent all those years? At first, I had no answers. Just tears, spilling hot and fast, shocking in their force. But slowly, words came. I told her about childhood nights hiding in my room, about the bruises I brushed off, about the way my parents always said he didn't mean it. I told her about the loneliness of carrying pain no one else wanted to see. She listened without judgment, nodding, waiting. And when I finally stopped, she said softly, "Catherine, you survived by staying quiet. But survival isn't the same as living." The truth of it cut deep. I had spent my life enduring, not living. My silence had kept me safe, but it had also kept me trapped. The days blurred together. Slowly, I regained small pieces of independence. I learned to hold a cup again, to dress myself clumsily, to write shaky letters with my left hand. Each victory was tiny, but it felt monumental. Each step forward reminded me that my brother hadn't destroyed me. Yet grief still followed me. Sometimes I would dream of my mother's face that night, her voice trembling as she begged me to lie. I would wake drenched in sweat, the words echoing, "Just say you fell." Those dreams haunted me more than the pain in my bones. Reeves visited often, sometimes just to sit with me, sometimes to check on my progress. She never pressured me, never asked more than I could give. But her presence was a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone. She told me about others who had faced similar battles, officers who had fought both personal and professional wars. She reminded me that speaking out wasn't betrayal, it was survival. One evening, as we shared a quiet meal at the small table in my apartment, she looked at me and said, "You know, family isn't just blood. Sometimes it's the people who stand with you when everyone else walks away." The words settled into me like stones into water. I thought about my crew, the sailors who had depended on me during deployments. I thought about the nurses who had washed my hair when I couldn't lift my arms. I thought about Reeves herself, steady and unshakable. Maybe she was right. Maybe family wasn't what I had lost, but what I was building now. By the time my casts were removed, I knew there was no going back. The ties had already been cut, even if part of me still ached for them. When I tried to imagine walking into that house again, I felt nothing but dread. The walls there had witnessed too much. The silence there had buried too much, so I chose not to return. It wasn't a dramatic declaration. No slammed doors, no angry speeches. Just a quiet decision made in the stillness of my apartment. I would not go back. I would not beg for love that was never mine. I would not carry silence anymore. The white days had stretched long, filled with pain and grief, but they had given me clarity. I was no longer theirs to silence. I was mine. And for the first time, that was enough. The summons came in a thin envelope, delivered by hand. I held it awkwardly, my still stiff fingers struggling to tear the flap. Inside, the words were blunt, clinical. Court date, location, charges, my brother's name in black ink beside mine. Seeing them together like that made my stomach twist. For weeks, I had prepared myself for this moment, telling myself I was strong enough, that I had chosen this path and I would see it through. But holding that letter, I felt the weight of everything pressed down again. The fractures in my arms had begun to heal, but the fractures inside me had only just started to show. Commander Reeves found me sitting at the kitchen table of my small apartment, the letter trembling in my hand. She read it once, folded it neatly, and set it down. Her voice was steady when she said, "It's time, time," as if the word itself could hold me together. The days leading up to the trial passed in a blur of preparation. Lawyers questioned me, drilling every detail of that night, every movement, every word. They wanted precision. What angle did he grab your wrist? How many seconds between the first shove and the second? Did you resist? Did you provoke him? The last question cut the deepest. I clenched my fists, or tried to, the stiffness still limiting me, and forced the truth out through my teeth. No, I didn't provoke him. They nodded, scribbled notes, moved on. But the echo of that question stayed. It wasn't the lawyer's voice I heard. It was my parents'. It was every excuse they had ever made for him, every way they had ever twisted my pain into my fault. The night before the trial, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the shadows shifting across the walls. My arms ached, but it wasn't the kind of pain medication could dull. It was memory, the sound of bones snapping, my mother's voice begging me to lie, my father's silence. At dawn, I rose, dressed slowly, and stared at myself in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was thinner, paler, but her eyes were sharper. I didn't see the girl who had grown up in silence. I saw the officer who had survived deployments, the woman who had broken chains. Reeves drove me to the courthouse. The building loomed gray and unforgiving, its stone steps slick with morning rain. My legs trembled as we climbed them, but she kept her pace steady, her presence a quiet anchor beside me. Inside, the air was cold, sterile. The benches creaked as people shifted, whispering. My heart pounded, each beat a drum in my chest. When the bailiff called the case, I rose, every part of me screaming to run, but I walked forward anyway. And then I saw him. My brother sat at the defense table, dressed in a suit that didn't quite fit, his hair combed neatly, his face clean-shaven. To anyone else, he might have looked respectable, even vulnerable, but I knew better. I saw the tightness in his jaw, the flicker of anger in his eyes when they met mine. He wasn't sorry. He was angry that I had broken the silence. My parents sat behind him. My mother clutched a handkerchief, dabbing at eyes that weren't wet. My father's face was carved from stone. They didn't look at me. The prosecutor began, their words firm and clear. Assault, severe bodily harm, evidence presented in medical records and eyewitness testimony. My name was spoken, my injuries laid bare. The X-rays flashed on a screen, bones twisted at impossible angles. Gasps rippled through the room. Then came the defense. Their lawyer rose, polished and confident. He painted a picture of an accident, of a heated argument that spiraled, of a young man who had simply lost control for a moment. He spoke of stress, of mental strain, of family dynamics. And then, like a knife, he turned the blade toward me. He suggested I had provoked him, that I had always been hard on my brother, that perhaps in the heat of the moment I had exaggerated. The words burned, but I kept my eyes steady. This was the script I knew too well. I had lived inside it for years. But this time, I would not play my part. When they called me to the stand, my legs nearly gave way. The oath felt heavy on my tongue. I sat down, the wood of the chair hard against my back, the eyes of the courtroom pressing into me. The prosecutor's questions came first. Clear, simple. What happened that night? I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing deep. Then I spoke. I told them about the footsteps, the accusations, the grip on my wrist. I told them about the shove, the crack, the fire of pain. I told them about his hand on my mouth, his words in my ear, my body collapsing to the floor. My voice shook, but I didn't stop. For the first time, I had an audience that couldn't look away. When the defense lawyer rose, I braced myself. His questions were sharper, laced with insinuation. Was I sure it hadn't been an accident? Was I certain I hadn't slipped? Was it possible that I had exaggerated in the shock of the moment? Each question felt like a blade, but I refused to bleed. I answered firmly, steadily. No, no, no. Finally, he asked, why would your own parents say you fell if you claim otherwise? The room stilled. My mother shifted behind him, her hand clutching the handkerchief tighter. I swallowed hard. Because they chose him, I said. They always chose him. Gasps again. My voice cracked, but I kept going. All my life, they told me to stay quiet to protect him, to carry the burden so he wouldn't have to. That night, they wanted me to do it again. But I won't. Not anymore. Silence hung heavy after that, broken only by the scratching of pens. The defense lawyer pressed his lips together, then sat down. I sat there, trembling, but something inside me felt steady for the first time. I had spoken. I had broken their silence in the one place it mattered most. The courtroom air felt heavy when I stepped down from the stand. Every eye seemed to follow me as I returned to my seat, my body trembling but my back straight. My arms still ached, stiff inside their braces, but for the first time I didn't feel broken. I felt seen. The prosecutor called more witnesses. Doctors spoke about the nature of my injuries, the unnatural angles of the fractures. They explained how the force required to cause such damage was far greater than what a fall could produce. A nurse recounted the night I was brought in, the way I whispered through clenched teeth that my brother had done this. The defense objected again and again, their voices sharp, but each objection was overruled. I watched my brother shift in his seat, his jaw tightening, his knuckles pale where his fists clenched. He looked like a man trapped, not by his actions, but by the truth finally dragging him into the light. And then, inevitably, they called him. He walked to the stand with his head lowered, his tie slightly crooked. To the jury, he might have looked nervous, remorseful even, but I knew that look. It was the same mask he had worn since childhood, the mask that fooled teachers, neighbors, even our parents. His lawyer guided him gently, questions crafted to paint him as misunderstood, overwhelmed. He said he had snapped under pressure, that it wasn't his fault that I had pushed him too far. He didn't look at me when he spoke those words, but I felt them like arrows. When the prosecutor cross-examined, the cracks in his story showed. He stumbled, contradicted himself, admitted details he hadn't meant to. Each slip pulled him deeper into the web of his own lies. By the end, his face was flushed, his mask slipping. But the hardest part came when my parents were called. My mother walked to the stand with her handkerchief clutched like a lifeline. Her voice trembled as she swore to tell the truth. And then, with all the conviction she could muster, she said I had fallen. That I had always been dramatic, that I had exaggerated injuries before. Her words sliced deeper than any cross-examination. I wanted to shout, to rise from my seat and shake her, but I stayed still. My lawyer objected, pointing to the medical records, to the x-rays, to the testimony already given. But the damage was done. My mother's voice echoed in my chest, the same voice that had soothed me as a child, now weaponized against me. My father was worse. He didn't bother with tears. His voice was flat, cold, dismissive. He said families argued. He said accidents happened. He said I was trying to destroy us from the inside. I sat there, shaking, feeling their betrayal carve deeper than any bone break. But then I remembered Reeves' words, family isn't just blood. I let that thought hold me upright as the lawyers sparred, as my parents left the stand, as the trial wound toward its end. Closing arguments came swiftly. The prosecutor reminded the jury of the medical evidence, the testimony, the photographs of my bruised and swollen arms. He spoke with fire, telling them this was not an accident, not a misunderstanding, but a deliberate act of violence. The defense clung to doubt. They painted me as vengeful, bitter, exaggerating. They asked the jury to remember that families break apart easily, that I was choosing to tear mine down. The jury left. The waiting began. Hours stretched, my heart beat loud in my ears. Reeves sat beside me calm, steady, her presence a quiet shield. I wanted to ask her what she thought, but I didn't. I just held on to the silence, letting it steady me for once. When the jury returned, the room held its breath. The foreman stood, the verdict in his hands. Guilty. The word rang out sharp and clear. My brother's head dropped. My mother gasped, a strangled sound. My father's jaw tightened, his eyes hard on me, full of something I couldn't name, anger, contempt, maybe hatred. The judge read the sentence, his voice measured. Prison time, mandatory counseling, probation after release. My brother's shoulders slumped, his hands gripping the table. For the first time, I saw fear on his face. As the gavel struck, it was as if a chain snapped inside me. Relief didn't flood in. Nothing so clean. Instead, there was emptiness, the kind that follows a storm. The truth had been spoken, justice declared, but the cost lay heavy. I glanced at my parents one last time. My mother's tears flowed freely now, not for me, but for the son who had finally faced consequences. My father's stare never softened. Neither of them looked at me, and in that silence I understood. The trial had given me justice, but it had also severed the last fragile ties between us. Walking out of the courthouse, the sky was pale, washed clean by the rain. Reeves walked beside me, her stride even. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but their noise felt distant. I stepped into the light, my chest aching, my arms heavy, but my voice intact. The silence was broken, and nothing would ever force it back again. The trial ended, the verdict was given, and for days afterward I felt suspended in air, like a leaf caught between winds. I thought that hearing the word guilty would fill me with triumph, or at least relief. Instead, what I felt was a hollow kind of quiet, a space where something used to be. Maybe it was family, maybe it was the illusion of belonging. Either way, it was gone. My body still carried the evidence of that night. My arms, bound in braces, throbbed every time I moved. The doctors said recovery would take months, maybe longer, depending on how faithfully I kept up with therapy. I nodded each time, but inside I wanted to scream. Months sounded endless. A lifetime could be hidden inside months. Rehabilitation became the axis of my days. Morning light broke through the blinds of my small apartment, pulling me into another round of exercises I dreaded but could not avoid. A physical therapist named Jenna arrived at 7 sharp, her cheerful knock on the door both a comfort and a curse. She was relentless, coaxing my arms into stretches that made my vision blur with pain. Lift, hold, release. Her voice was steady, encouraging, but I hated every second. My muscles trembled, sweat dripping down my temples, tears burning my eyes. Simple motions were battles, raising a spoon, brushing my teeth, lifting a glass of water. Each attempt ended with frustration and sometimes rage. I threw things more than once, as much as my weak arms allowed, and Jenna never flinched. She just picked them up, set them back, and told me to try again tomorrow. Those mornings left me exhausted, but the afternoons were worse. Counseling. A quiet room, a notebook on a table, a woman with soft eyes asking questions I had spent my entire life avoiding. "What did you lose when you told the truth?" The first time she asked, I couldn't answer. My throat locked, my chest tightened, and I sat in silence while tears rolled down my face. She waited. She didn't rush me. She just let the question hang between us like smoke. Later, I found the answer. I had lost my family. Or maybe I had lost the illusion that they were ever truly mine. That realization broke me in ways the fractures never could. Evenings were long and unbearably quiet. The apartment, though safe, felt more like a cell when the sun went down. I sat by the window watching headlights slide across wet pavement, listening to the city hum beyond the glass. I wanted to call someone, to hear a voice that cared, but my phone stayed silent. My parents had vanished from my life the moment the verdict was read. They didn't write. They didn't call. It was as if I had been erased, a daughter they no longer claimed. I told myself I didn't need them, but the truth gnawed at me in the dark. I wanted them to choose me. I wanted them to love me more than they loved their silence. That was the wound that refused to heal. Commander Reeves became the only steady presence. She visited often, her posture straight as ever, her gaze calm and assessing. She didn't pity me. She didn't tell me I was brave or strong when I didn't feel it. She simply reminded me of who I had been before all this. An officer. A leader. a woman who had survived deployments and storms far from home. One day she said, "You can't keep looking backward, Catherine. That house, that life, it's over. The question is, what are you going to build now?" The words haunted me. Build, as if I had the tools, as if I wasn't still fractured inside. But she was right. I couldn't live in the ruins forever. A week later, she took me to the rehabilitation unit on base. She said it would be good for me to see others rebuilding, others who knew what it meant to have bodies betray them. The unit was bright, almost blinding, with wide windows and polished floors. Soldiers moved slowly through exercises, parallel bars, resistance bands, stationary bikes. Some had prosthetics. Some had scars that told their own stories. The air smelled of disinfectant and determination. I stood at the edge, watching, my stomach tight. Then my eyes caught a girl younger than me, maybe 20, gripping the bars with trembling hands. Sweat poured down her temples as she tried to force her legs to move. Her name, I later learned, was Kira. She stumbled, cursed softly, pushed herself up again. The effort in her face mirrored my own struggle in therapy, the desperation, the refusal to surrender. Reeves nudged me. "Go on," she whispered. I shook my head. What could I offer? I was still broken, still piecing myself together. But Kira's eyes found mine, and in them I saw recognition. She didn't need perfection. She needed someone who understood. I walked slowly to her bench after she collapsed onto it, gasping. I sat beside her, my arms heavy in their braces. My voice came out low. "I know what it feels like to hate your own body, to feel like it's betrayed you." She looked at me wide-eyed. "What happened to you?" And for the first time outside a courtroom, I told my story. Not all of it, just enough. Enough for her to know she wasn't alone. Enough for me to feel the words land in open air and not vanish. Kira nodded slowly. Then she said, "If you can keep going, maybe I can too." Her words stayed with me that night. I sat at my small desk, staring at the blank page of a notebook Reeves had given me weeks earlier. I picked up a pen, my grip shaky, and began to write. Not a polished story, just fragments. Sentences about silence, about breaking, about pain that doesn't leave bruises but cuts deeper. The page filled quickly. Then another. My handwriting was crooked, uneven, but alive. As the rain tapped softly on the glass, I realized something I hadn't before. I wasn't just writing for myself. I was writing for the girl on the bench, for anyone who had ever been told to swallow their truth. That thought terrified me, but it also freed me. Writing became my new ritual. Every night, I sat by the window with the notebook balanced awkwardly on my lap, pen slipping between fingers that still struggled with stiffness. At first, the words came in fragments, memories scrawled out of order, flashes of anger, lines that made no sense. But over time, they began to form something larger. A narrative. My narrative. I wrote about the storm, the crack of bones, my mother's plea. I wrote about silence, how it clings to you like a second skin, how it suffocates until you forget how to breathe. I wrote about survival, the small victories of lifting a glass of water, the enormous triumph of speaking a single truth. The pages filled, messy and raw, but they were alive. And in them, I began to find myself. During the day, I returned to the rehabilitation unit. Kira welcomed me each time with a grin that grew wider as her steps became steadier. She told me my words gave her strength, but the truth was, she gave me just as much. Watching her push forward reminded me that healing wasn't about erasing scars. It was about living with them. Soon, others began to approach me. A man with a prosthetic leg who admitted he hadn't slept without nightmares in months. A young recruit who whispered that she felt invisible, her injuries dismissed because they weren't visible enough. They looked at me with cautious hope, and I found myself sharing more of my story than I thought possible. Not all of it, some wounds were still too fresh, but enough to open doors. Each time I spoke, I felt the silence retreat further, losing its hold. Reeves noticed the change. One afternoon, she joined me at the unit, watching as I spoke quietly to a group of 3 recovering soldiers. Later, over coffee in the small cafeteria, she said, "You found something here, haven't you?" I hesitated, staring at the steam rising from my cup. "I don't know what to call it." She smiled faintly. "Purpose." The word landed heavy but right. Purpose. Not the same as duty, not the same as survival. Something beyond, something new. The idea frightened me. For so long, my life had been about endurance, about holding my breath through storms and hoping I survived. Purpose was different. It was active, intentional. It required me to step forward instead of merely withstand. That night, I opened my notebook again, but instead of writing for myself, I wrote as if someone else were listening. I wrote to the girl who thought her silence was the only thing keeping her family together. I wrote to the soldier who thought weakness made him unworthy. I wrote to anyone who had been told their pain was too inconvenient to acknowledge, and as the words spilled out, I felt something shift. I was no longer just a woman recording her survival. I was reaching outward. Weeks passed. My arms grew stronger, though the scars of stiffness remained. The doctors said I might never regain full range, but I no longer measured myself only by what I had lost. My body bore proof of what I had endured, but my voice bore proof of who I had become. One afternoon, Reeves handed me a flyer. It was for a small panel discussion at the base, soldiers sharing personal experiences of resilience. They had invited her to speak, but she wanted me to take her place. My stomach dropped. I wasn't ready. My story was messy, raw, unfinished. Speaking it aloud felt dangerous, like exposing an open wound. But Reeves only said they don't need perfection. They need truth. The day of the panel, I stood behind the curtain, hands trembling, notebook clutched to my chest. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. The moderator introduced me, and the applause that followed felt unreal. For a moment, I wanted to run. Then I remembered Kira's words, "If you can keep going, maybe I can too." I stepped onto the stage. The lights blinded me, the crowd blurred, but I opened my notebook and read the first line I had ever written. "Silence is not strength." The words rang out, clear and unshaken. I told my story, not every detail, not the darkest corners, but enough. Enough to let them know that silence can destroy and that breaking it can save. When I finished, the room was silent for a heartbeat. Then the applause came, rolling like thunder. Faces in the crowd blurred, but I saw tears, nods, hands gripping chairs tightly. They weren't applauding perfection. They were applauding survival. Afterward, people came to me. Some thanked me. Some shared their own fragments of stories. One young man said, "I thought I was the only one." My voice shook when I told him, "You're not." That night, back in my apartment, I stared at the notebook on my desk. For the first time, I saw it not as a diary, but as the beginning of something larger. A book, maybe. A message. A voice that might reach beyond these walls. I still grieved. I still woke some nights with the echo of my mother's plea ringing in my ears. I still felt the ache of absence where family should have been. But for the first time, those wounds weren't the whole of me. They were the soil where something new had taken root. Purpose. I whispered the word into the quiet, testing how it felt on my tongue. Felt like a promise. The panel where I first read from my notebook had felt small, almost intimate. A single room, a few dozen people, the kind of gathering where faces were clear and I could see every flicker of emotion in their eyes. I told myself it was a one-time thing, a necessary step in healing, something I could put away afterward like a chapter finished in a book. But life had other plans. In the weeks that followed, letters began to appear. Some slipped under my door at the rehab unit. Some delivered quietly by orderlies who nodded as if they understood the secrecy. Others came as folded scraps pressed into my palm when no one was looking. They were confessions disguised as thank you notes. A woman wrote that her husband, also a sailor, had broken her ribs once, and she had told everyone she had fallen down the stairs. She said she had never spoken it aloud before. A young man wrote that his commanding officer had ridiculed him for his anxiety until he stopped eating, and no one knew. Another wrote simply, "Thank you for reminding me I am not the only one." I read them late at night in my apartment, the lamplight soft and yellow. My arms still ached, stiff even after months of therapy, but it was my chest that felt heavier with every letter. So much pain. So many silences stacked on top of one another, a mountain of secrets carried by too many people who believed they were alone. Reeves noticed before I did. She had a way of watching me without making me feel observed. One afternoon, when she visited, she glanced at the growing pile of folded notes on my desk and said, "They trust you with their truth. That means something." I wanted to laugh, maybe even cry. Trust. A word that had always felt slippery in my family. Trust was what my parents had asked me to betray when they begged me to lie. And now strangers were offering it freely, as if they saw something in me worth believing in. It terrified me, yet I kept answering the call. I returned to the rehabilitation unit, not only for therapy but for connection. I spoke with soldiers who had lost limbs and with recruits who had lost hope. Sometimes I told them pieces of my own story, sometimes I just listened. And each time I felt the silence I had carried for decades loosen its grip, little by little, like a fist unclenching. One day, a captain from another unit stopped me in the hallway. He said he had heard me speak during the panel, and he wanted me to come to his base to share my story with his team. I froze, my heart racing. Speaking once had nearly broken me. Doing it again on purpose in front of strangers, it felt impossible. But then I thought of Kira, of the way her shoulders had straightened when I admitted my own weakness. I thought of the letters, of the ink-stained words begging not to be forgotten. And so I said yes, though my hands shook as I agreed. The night before that event, I barely slept. My notebook was a battlefield of scratched-out lines and rewritten paragraphs. I kept rewriting my opening, convinced it needed to be sharper, stronger, more perfect. But nothing satisfied me. Near dawn, exhausted, I closed the book and whispered to myself, just tell the truth. The hall I walked into the next day was nothing like the small panel I had begun with. This was a cavern of metal and banners, rows upon rows of uniforms filling the seats. The lights glared hot on my skin, and the murmurs of the crowd rolled like waves. My heart hammered, my legs felt unsteady, and for a moment I thought I would faint. When the moderator introduced me, I walked to the podium with my notebook clutched to my chest like a shield. The microphone waited, black and cold, and the silence that followed pressed hard against my ears. I began with my name. Then I said the truth, that I had been silent most of my life. It was not eloquent. It was not polished. But the words landed. I felt it in the way the room stilled, the way bodies leaned forward, the way eyes locked on me and did not look away. I spoke of silence as if it were a second skin, one I had been forced to wear. I spoke of the night of the storm without naming names, about the pain of betrayal and the harder pain of speaking up. I spoke of how silence protects no one but those who exploit it. My voice shook at first, but the more I spoke, the stronger it became. It was as if every word peeled away another layer of fear. When I finished, there was a heartbeat of stillness, and then applause, sudden and thunderous, crashing against me like surf. I blinked against the lights, against the tears that threatened to fall. Afterward, the line formed. Dozens of soldiers and civilians approached me. Some offered brief handshakes, others lingered with trembling words. A young officer whispered, "My father used to hit me. I thought I was weak for not fighting back." An older woman said, "I kept quiet for 40 years. Hearing you tonight made me wish I had spoken sooner, but it also made me believe it's not too late." I held their words like glass, fragile and precious. I promised nothing more than to listen, but listening was enough. That night, back in my apartment, the notebooks on my desk looked different. They were no longer diaries. They were bridges. Every page I filled was another plank laid down, connecting me to others who had walked in silence too long. Reeves visited the next day. She stood by the window, hands clasped behind her back as I told her about the event, about the stories people had shared with me. When I finished, she nodded slowly and said, "You're not just surviving anymore. You're leading." The word startled me. Leader. It had always meant orders, responsibility, command. I had been a leader once on deployments, making decisions that affected lives. But this was different. This was leadership that came not from authority but from vulnerability. And I realized Reeves was right. People were listening. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. What I didn't know then was that this new role, this voice I was learning to wield, would carry me further than I could imagine. It would connect me to communities I had never seen, to truths buried deep beneath my own history. And one of those truths would unravel everything I thought I knew. The weeks after that speech were unlike anything I had ever known. The silence I had carried for decades had broken, and in its place came a flood. Letters arrived daily, some official, some anonymous. My inbox filled with invitations to speak, not just at bases but at schools, community centers, even churches. At first, I tried to refuse most of them. I told myself I wasn't ready, that I didn't want to become a symbol. But the truth was harder. I was afraid. Afraid that once I stepped further into the light, there would be no turning back. Reeves was the one who pushed me. Not with force, never with pressure, but with steady reminders. Each story you receive, she said one evening, represents someone who stayed silent for years. If your voice gave them 1 ounce of courage, imagine what more of it could do. Her words gnawed at me until I couldn't ignore them. So I said yes. My calendar filled. Some days I stood in small classrooms, chairs arranged in uneven circles. Other days I stood on stages beneath glaring lights, rows of uniforms staring up at me. In each space I told my story, not with perfect polish, not always with grace, but always with truth. And the response was the same everywhere. Heads nodding. Tears wiped quickly away. Applause that felt less like celebration and more like release, but with the attention came scrutiny. Local newspapers wrote about me, painting me as an advocate, a rising voice for survivors. Some praised me, others questioned my motives. An online article described me as a woman determined to dismantle the silence of the Navy family. Another accused me of exaggeration, of weaponizing my story for attention. The words stung, even though I tried to ignore them. Late at night, when the city was quiet, I found myself scrolling through comments I shouldn't have read. Some called me brave, others called me a liar. The latter hit harder because it was the language I had grown up hearing. I told myself the criticism didn't matter. But sometimes, lying awake at 2 in the morning, I wondered if I was strong enough to keep going. Still, I didn't stop. At one event, a woman named Elaine approached me after my talk. She was older, maybe in her 50s, her uniform pressed sharp, her eyes tired. She waited until the room had emptied before speaking. "I've been waiting years to hear someone like you," she said. "I stayed silent for too long." When I finally tried to speak, no one believed me. Her voice trembled, and I recognized the look in her eyes, the look of someone carrying decades of silence like a stone around her neck. I took her hand, clumsy with my still stiff fingers, and told her she wasn't alone anymore. She wept quietly, and I held her hand tighter. Moments like that grounded me. They reminded me why I had chosen this path, why I kept standing in rooms full of strangers telling them pieces of my life. But there were shadows, too. One evening, I returned to my apartment to find an envelope slid under my door. No return address. My stomach knotted as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with words scrawled in jagged handwriting. "Stop lying. You know it wasn't like that." I sat frozen on the couch, the letter trembling in my hand. My first thought was my brother, but he was in prison. My second thought was worse, that someone close to my family had written it, someone determined to protect the silence I had broken. I showed Reeves the letter the next day. She frowned, her eyes dark. "People who protect abusers will always try to rewrite the story," she said. "That's what silence is built on, denial." Her words were steady, but I could tell she was worried. She insisted I keep the letter in case more came. And more did. Not many, but enough. Some anonymous emails. One voicemail from a blocked number where a voice whispered, "You'll regret this." Each message was a reminder that breaking silence doesn't end the fight, it only changes its shape. Still, I pushed forward. I poured myself into writing, filling notebook after notebook, until Reeves finally said, "Catherine, you should think about publishing. Not just speeches. A book." The thought made my chest tighten. A book was permanent. A book would mean my story was no longer mine alone. But I also knew she was right. The pages on my desk weren't just ramblings. They were testimony. They were survival carved into words. I began shaping them, late nights at my desk, drafts piling up. Some days I wrote until dawn, my eyes burning, my body aching. It felt dangerous, exposing myself again and again on the page, but it also felt necessary. As I worked, I began to feel the stirrings of something I couldn't quite name. A sense that there were pieces of my past I hadn't yet faced, corners of memory I had avoided because they were too sharp. And with each draft, with each story I heard from others, those corners pressed closer, demanding to be acknowledged. One night, as rain lashed against the window, I found myself writing a sentence I had never dared put on paper before. Maybe it wasn't just my brother. The pen trembled in my hand. The words stared back at me, stark and accusing. I couldn't explain why they had come, only that something deep inside me whispered that my story wasn't complete, that there were truths buried beneath the surface, waiting to shatter everything again. I closed the notebook, my hands shaking. For the first time since the trial, fear returned, not of silence, but of what might come if I dug deeper into the past I had tried so hard to escape. The notebooks kept piling up on my desk. Draft after draft, story after story, my truth bleeding onto the pages in crooked handwriting. Writing had become my ritual, my anchor. Yet beneath the steady rhythm of pen against paper, something unsettled stirred. Each time I read back over my words, I felt the weight of something missing. It was a nagging presence, like a shadow at the edge of vision. The line I had written weeks earlier, "Maybe it wasn't just my brother," haunted me. I told myself it was exhaustion, paranoia from the hate letters, echoes of trauma that played tricks on memory, but the whisper refused to fade. One afternoon, while revisiting old journals I had kept during my deployments, I noticed something. In one entry, written after a rare trip home years ago, I had described a strange heaviness. "I don't feel safe here," I had scribbled, though I hadn't explained why. My brother hadn't even been around that visit. He was away at college. So why had I felt unsafe? The realization struck like ice. Memories shifted, fragile fragments long buried. My skin crawled. I tried to push it away, but the body remembers what the mind resists. Some nights I woke drenched in sweat, flashes of blurred images invading my dreams, hands gripping my arms, a voice that wasn't my brother's whispering to keep quiet. I couldn't see the face, but the tone was chillingly familiar. One evening, determined to silence the doubts, I called my mother. It had been months since the trial, months of silence between us. When she answered, her voice was flat, guarded. I asked her a question I had never dared before. Was it only him? There was a pause, too long, too heavy. Then she said quickly, "Don't start this again, Catherine. What's done is done." Her voice cracked on the last word. The line went dead, but I sat frozen, the phone slipping from my hand. Her reaction wasn't denial. It was fear. That night, I pulled out an old photo album from a box Reeves had helped me recover from storage. The pictures were faded, smiles stiff and posed. But staring at my father's face, something inside me recoiled. The tightness in his jaw, the cold in his eyes, it was all too familiar. The same coldness I had felt that night in court when he looked at me as if I were the enemy. My stomach turned. Could it have been him? Was that why my mother had begged me to lie, not just to protect my brother, but to bury a darker truth? I wanted to dismiss it as imagination, a cruel trick of trauma. But then I remembered the letters, the anonymous threats, the whisper that I would regret speaking. My father had never forgiven me for exposing my brother. What if he feared I might expose more? The possibility hollowed me out. It was as if the ground beneath my life cracked open, revealing layers I had never dared to see. I confided in Reeves. Sitting across from her in the quiet of my apartment, I told her everything: the journals, the dreams, the phone call, the suspicion that my father might have been more than just silent all those years. She listened without interrupting, her eyes steady, her hands folded neatly in her lap. When I finished, trembling, she said softly, "Catherine, sometimes the body remembers before the mind does. If you think there's more, it's worth exploring, even if it hurts." Her words terrified me. Exploring meant tearing open wounds I wasn't sure I could survive, but it also meant I might finally know the truth. The next weeks became a blur of research and confrontation. I dug into family records, old medical visits from my childhood, scraps of memory that suddenly made sense in new, chilling ways. The headaches I used to get, the bruises I couldn't explain, the way I used to hide in closets when my father was angry. I had told myself for years that I was clumsy, fragile, overdramatic. But what if I had been none of those things? What if I had simply been silenced? The truth, when it began to crystallize, was unbearable. My father hadn't just failed to protect me. He had been the first to hurt me. My brother had repeated the pattern, and my mother had chosen silence as her form of survival. The entire structure of my family had been built not on love, but on silence and denial. I felt sick. I wanted to vomit every time the thought surfaced. But the more I resisted, the clearer it became. The storm years ago hadn't been an isolated night of violence. It had been the culmination of years of buried abuse, patterns so deeply ingrained that I hadn't even recognized them until now. It was the twist I had never wanted to face. My story was not only about my brother. It had always been about my father, too. The revelation hollowed me out. For days, I could barely move, barely think. I sat in my apartment staring at the stack of notebooks that had once felt like salvation and now looked like a pile of unanswered questions. If my father had been the first to break me, what did that make my entire story? Had I been telling it wrong all along? I wanted to shove the suspicion aside, to bury it like my mother had, but the body refused to let me. Every ache in my arms, every scar I traced with my fingertips, carried echoes of older wounds. My chest tightened with memories I couldn't fully see but could no longer deny. Reeves didn't push me, but she didn't let me retreat either. She came every day, steady as a lighthouse, sitting in silence when I couldn't speak and offering questions when I could. "What does your body remember?" she asked once, her voice low, patient. And slowly, I began to remember. Not in neat flashes, but in fragments. The smell of whiskey on his breath, the way footsteps on the stairs made me curl small in my bed, the sting of a slap explained away as discipline. Pieces fell together until I could no longer pretend. It was not just my brother. The weight of it nearly crushed me. To admit it was to destroy what little remained of my family, but to deny it would be to continue their silence. And I could not do that anymore. I began to write again, this time not for speeches or panels, not for soldiers or strangers. I wrote for myself. I wrote the truth I had buried so deep that I barely recognized it as mine. The words poured out, ugly, raw, violent. Sometimes I tore the pages in fury. Sometimes I wept until I could not see the ink. But I did not stop. When the notebooks filled, I took them to therapy. My counselor read quietly, her eyes wet, then looked at me with a kind of reverence. "You have carried this longer than any person should," she said, "but you don't have to carry it alone anymore." That became my mantra. I don't have to carry it alone. The next time I spoke at an event, I hesitated before the podium, notebook in hand. For weeks, I had debated whether to share the fuller truth. Did the world need to know it was not only my brother? Would it change anything, or would it only reopen wounds that had barely begun to heal? When I began to speak, I felt the weight of choice pressing down. My voice trembled as I recounted what I had always shared: the storm, the fractures, the silence. And then, for the first time, I added, silence does not always protect us from strangers. Sometimes, silence protects the ones closest to us. Sometimes, it protects the ones who were supposed to love us first. The room stilled. I didn't name him. I didn't have to. The truth was in my voice, in the way my hands shook as I held the pages. When I finished, the applause was softer this time, not thunderous but reverent. People rose to their feet slowly, as if recognizing the enormity of what I had given them. Afterward, they came to me again, as they always did, sharing pieces of their own truths. But this time, their words carried something new: courage. I realized then that my story had never been only about exposing my family. It had always been about breaking the cycle of silence, no matter where it lived. Months passed. The letters continued, some full of thanks, some of hate, but I no longer feared them. My book began to take shape, not as a polished memoir but as a testimony, a weaving of my story with the voices of others who had broken their own silences. It was messy, imperfect, but alive. On the day the manuscript was finished, I stood by the window watching the sun break through after rain. The city glistened, streets slick, the world alive with light. I pressed my palm against the glass and whispered, I am not silent anymore. It was not triumph. It was not peace. It was something stronger. Resolution. I knew now that I could never reclaim the family I had lost. But I could build something better: community, truth, a life rooted not in silence but in voice. And as I turned back to my desk, to the stack of notebooks that had carried me through the storm, I knew my story was no longer mine alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told to stay quiet. The silence was broken. For good.